All right, this morning we're going to draw your attention in a little different direction. We've been focusing on God's expectations, and we'll plan to get back to that soon, but we're going to just take a little bit of a break today for scripture or a lesson in Malachi chapter 3. Malachi chapter 3. Now, maybe some of you that are familiar with the scripture pretty well, right away you may think, oh, Malachi 3, he's going to talk about tithing. Talk about our offerings and giving money. And certainly that is a big part of this. And of course, God saying that they had robbed him in that they did not give him their tithe, which normally we would think of as a 10% sort of a thank you gift back to God. And along with our offerings, it does mention both of those things here. And so some of you may already be thinking, okay, well, this refers to our giving. But the last few verses of this chapter, and then on even into chapter 4 somewhat maybe, but we're not going to really delve into that. A lot of that seems to be sort of messianic prophecy, and I'm not going to get into that part of it necessarily this morning, but I do want to focus on the last several verses there of Malachi 3. Verse number 16. Then they that feared the Lord spake often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord and that thought upon his name. And they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels, and I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him. Then shall ye return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. What I want to talk to you about this morning is the unfinished book. The unfinished book. God obviously saw things differently than these people did. And earlier, that's the same idea, even earlier, but it was on the other side of things, where he's saying, you've robbed me. And they say, well, how is that? How have we robbed you? And now in this case, it may be that they would say, why is it that wickedness prevails? And God says, wait a minute, you haven't seen the whole story. You don't know the rest of the unfinished book. And so that's what I want to focus on. It mentions there in verse 16, a book of remembrance was written before him. And so we're going to focus on the unfinished book here this morning. Maybe you've heard the tale just this past week, I guess maybe. I came across it again. And just a fable, I guess you would say. But the tale of two traveling angels, one older and one younger, that were making their way around the earth. I don't know all the details there of how even the story goes totally, but they stopped for the night at a wealthy family, and for whatever reason the family was rude and maybe didn't trust these angels or something, and so they gave them a place to stay, but they made it down in the cold and damp basement. And as they were preparing their bed for the evening there on the hard floor, the older angel there saw a hole in the wall and he repaired it. Well, the younger angel couldn't quite understand that. With the way they've treated us, you're doing special things to help them out. That doesn't seem quite right. And then they got their night's rest, or however much they could anyway. And then the next evening, they found their way to another home. This time it was to a very poor farmer and his wife. And when they knocked on the door, the host greeted them warmly, welcomed them in. They didn't have much, but they offered their best to these angels, and even their own bed so that they would be able to get a good night's rest. But in the morning, the farmer and his wife were out in the yard weeping because their only cow was dead in the field. And it was their source of milk, and their only source of milk, apparently. And so this was a very tragic loss for them. Again, the younger angel could not understand. Why is it that you would have patched the wall for that rude and obnoxious family, and now these ones that have treated us so well, you didn't spare their cow? And the older angel, maybe more than just once, but at least in the one case anyway, he ended up answering, things are not always what they seem. Things aren't always what they seem. And of course, as the fable or parable goes, then in the first home, as they were preparing the bed there in the basement, he noticed that there was some gold hidden away in a crack there in the wall, and he covered it over so that the miser wouldn't be able to find it. In the latter case, when the farmer and his wife, they think, oh, what about my cow? But the older angel said, actually, the death angel came last night, was going to take the farmer's wife, but I offered the cow instead. Do you think that the farmer and his wife would have been happy with those arrangements if they could have seen it? But they didn't see it all, and neither do we. We don't see what all is happening. And I understand, just a little fable, as maybe you don't even care for it in some ways. I don't like the idea of angels maybe hindering people necessarily, or having a bad attitude that well, they didn't help me, so I won't help them. I don't like that. But still, there is sort of a truth that's found through the parable that also applies at the end here of Malachi, and really the end of the Old Testament. That's where we are. And maybe we need to sort of think on this a little bit. Sometimes we may forget that there is more to the whole story. There's more than meets the eye. We don't see things clearly. And again, the Old Testament is filled with accounts of the godly versus the wicked, and how sometimes it seems like the wicked prevail and the righteous are poor and destitute and struggling. But we again see that things are not always as they appear. The book is still unfinished. And perhaps this is a fitting conclusion to the Old Testament to say, wait a minute, what you see here in the Old Testament, though it's helpful and it's valuable, it's good teaching for us. We need to recognize how God sees us and what he wants to do for us. But don't forget, the book's not finished. Keep reading, keep going through, and you'll see what God has in mind in the end. It's too early to make judgments on fairness right now. And so we need to recognize the unfinished book. While the events of the world around us, even now, seem to sort of foretell the soon return of Jesus, and lots of people discussing that. And maybe in these days, we need to grasp a little bit again what's going on here. When we may feel like this is not fair, and why doesn't God help the righteous, and why is this not working out as we thought it should? And we need to remember what is mentioned here. Life may not seem fair. We may wonder sometimes about the blatant disregard for God and righteousness that's all around us. But don't forget, the book's not finished. We're not done with the story, and it will be worth it to be holy and true. So let me just touch on a few things we notice here. I want to especially focus, well, I guess each of the verses to some extent, but we're going to spend a little bit of time here in the first verse where it talks about those who feared the Lord and how they spake often one to another. There's several things here that I want to touch on. But the first one I want to notice with you is just the simple reminder or just noticing the faithful band. The faithful band of believers. Let's first notice here how God kind of gives us the description of these people of God. Yes, they lived in a wicked culture. That's what God had been sort of reprimanding them for and saying, you are not righteous. You are robbing me. And so, yes, God saw all those things, but how did he, maybe describe, I guess, the righteous people? What were they doing? What was going on there? Well, there are several aspects here. Yes, it may have been difficult times, but there were several things that were involved here among these who really were still holding on. Again, I know that sometimes we have the Elijah mentality and we think it's just us. Nobody else wants to serve God. And God might once in a while want to just sort of open our eyes and say, well, no, wait a minute. I've got 7,000 more, or who knows how many in these days. There are many more that are trying to serve God. And there were some that even though things looked bad and even though there was wickedness all around them and people maybe didn't want to mind God like they should, yet still there were a few. And they banded together. Let me just touch on the faithful band and what they did. First of all, notice that they encouraged each other. They that feared the Lord spake often one to another. And really, that's why we gather like this. That's why we try to worship together. That's why we need a church family. We need more than even just the online presence, though that may be good. We need more than just the radio in the parking lot. We need to be able to see one another. We need to be able to talk to one another. We are a body. We are a faithful band who are needing to encourage one another. Sometimes we can get sort of inwardly focused or something, and we focus on me and my need and what I'm dealing with, and we forget that we're here to be an encouragement to someone else. But the believers here, as few as they may have been, they spoke often one to another. They were encouraging one another. They were trying to help each other to keep the faith and keep pressing onward. They spake often one to another. And then you go a little bit further here. They also actually, you back up just a little bit. We'll just touch on that issue of how they feared the Lord. Really, that's honor, reverence. It's not talking about fear as in a quaking, slavish fear, but that they were reverencing God. They cared about Him. They wanted to honor Him. They wanted to do what He wanted them to do. And I understand that sometimes we may sometimes even look at other people, other so-called believers at least. We're not their judge, but we look around and we may think, well, I don't know about them. I don't know. They don't seem to be very sincere or whatever else it may be. But those who honor God, those who really truly please Him, are noticed by God. We'll talk about that in just a little bit, but we need to recognize that we are in this together, and we need to honor God and give Him first place, be obedient to Him, whatever He wants us to do. They feared or honored the Lord. They reverenced Him. So, first two things. They encouraged one another, and they kept their reverence for God, their honor for Him, which actually I believe it might be either in this chapter or a nearby one, might be a nearby prophet there, that is basically saying, where's my honor? You don't care about me. And yet these people did. They feared the Lord. And then they also, at the very end of that, it mentions it again, for them that feared the Lord and that thought upon His name. And so maybe we just add in here, they also meditated on God. And really, I think we maybe need to talk about this once in a while because it deals with our priorities. Do we meditate on the things of God? Do we care about what pleases Him? Are we trying to do what will bring Him glory and honor? Do we do things that help us to have the mindset of obedience and doing what God would have us to do? I know these things may not seem vital to some people, but God took note of it here. And it mentions that there was a book of remembrance for these people who encouraged one another, those who feared the Lord, those who meditated on Him. It's still vital for us even today. And maybe especially in these days for us to recognize that the enemy is fighting us. But we need each other. We need to honor God and we need to meditate on Him and do what He would be pleased with. Maybe that kind of attitude wasn't popular on the earth at that time, and it's probably not very popular these days either. But such behavior was very popular in heaven. God took note of it, and He wrote a book of remembrance, or had the angels, whoever it was, write the book of remembrance for those who were the faithful band. Not only that, but I want to quickly notice also the jewels that he talks about in verse 17, and I've referred to this as the finest beauty. The finest beauty. Surely there's no greater honor than being claimed by God. By knowing that He's pleased. By knowing that He loves us and that He is honored by what we're doing. There's two phrases there that I think kind of bear that out. And they're both very important here. Notice that in the first little phrase there, he says, and they shall be mine. What better honor could we receive, if I could put it that way? What greater privilege do we have than to be called God's by Him? That He knows who we are, He cares about us, and we are His. And then he says also, in that day when I make up my jewels, they will be one of them. They're going to be a part of this. When I make up my jewels, the finest beauty that I have available are those who have served me. It's basically what God is saying here. And again, things are not always as they seem. Right now, we may seem like strangers and pilgrims. We may feel like the underdog sometimes. We may feel like nobody really cares about God or the life that we're trying to live for God. People may wonder about our behavior, about our appearance. But God's keeping a book of favorites. God's keeping a book of His finest, and it includes the faithful. We just talked about them right there in verse 16, but I believe that He also finds some even today, and we need to be among the faithful few. I know the world may scoff, they may scorn at a careful Christian. It's just the way it is. We may not like it, we may not feel comfortable, but the story's not over yet. What a wonderful privilege to know that God is still writing the story. And the end will be well worthwhile. And will shine in beauty. Will belong to Christ when He takes up His jewels. What a wonderful thing. The finest beauty. So we have the faithful band, the finest beauty, and then the last one is the final balance. Not only is it found right here in verse 18 and maybe even some others as well, but even in chapter 4, I believe you can find some of that as well, where you might say it's these last verses, just the final verses of the Old Testament are pointing to the change of outlook for the righteous and the wicked. As much as the Old Testament was full of those who did not mind God, those who maybe were at one time but they strayed away, those who went off into idolatry, those who did not really stay true, all those things, and then the righteous few, Daniel and his 3 friends, David, on and on. You could name your own number. Even Jeremiah would be one I think I mentioned recently. And so in the midst of all that, there's a change. And what seems to be the case right now will not always be. Those who have banded together to make it safely through this world's unfair attacks are going to find the record is set straight eventually. It may seem a long way out there. It may seem far beyond what we thought it should be. But the end of the book shows another side to the story. And there is the final balancing. I guess I'm thinking a little bit of one of those scales, and where for a while it looks like the side of evil and wickedness is kind of gaining the advantage. But eventually the tide will turn. And you might say God puts His finger on the scales and He shows wickedness will not prevail. And it's going to be different. There's going to be a final balancing, a final accounting. Must have been frustrating to these righteous few who always seem to be overridden. They wanted to do right. And yet you can just read through even this book in general, and you can start seeing how there's just a variety of examples, maybe we'd say, of those who were not following after God. They were not concerned about pleasing Him. But eventually, it was going to be different. I'm sure the righteous, even then, even like we do today, I suppose, they probably longed for society that would please God, and they longed for revival to flourish, and maybe even prayed that way, that God would somehow turn hearts back to Himself. It just never seemed to happen. The people just would ignore the things of God or make justification for their wicked ways. Good was always, you might say, sort of on the loss side of the ledger. It never is really overcoming. Always the evil prevails. Always the evil is taking the upper hand. But Malachi reminds his readers here that there's a coming reckoning, maybe we would say. A divine balance to the scale. Truth will be clear again. Of course, the fire will burn up the chaff, the wicked ones, and the godly will be rewarded. Notice there that he says in verse 18, "Then shall ye return." And the way I read this, I don't know if this is altogether the way Malachi meant it or the way God meant it through Malachi, but this is the way I see it. Then shall ye return, and you're going to take another look. You're going to come back to this issue. Whereas right now you think that everything is going badly for the righteous and everything's going good for the wicked, but eventually you're going to kind of turn and you're going to view this again, and you're going to have a different mindset. You're going to discern between the righteous and the wicked. You're going to see what's different between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. And it's going to be from a different perspective in the final balancing of things, and you'll recognize it always paid to serve God. Evil may seem to prevail for a while, but it will be worth it in the final reckoning, the final balance. Maybe I could just say it this way. Because of those final 2 points, the jewels that he's making up, the balancing of the scale, I believe that especially urges us back to the first point. Because really, right now we have to be among the faithful band. We have to be among those who are staying true when it's not easy. We have to recognize there's coming a better day. There's coming a reckoning day. And yes, it may seem like evil is overwhelming at times, but we need to band together. We need to encourage one another. We need to meditate on the good things of God. We need to keep our eyes on the sky, so to speak. We need to be looking toward the final reckoning and the day when God will come through again for his people. Things are not always as they seem. And it will be worth it all after a while if we've lived for God's pleasure. That chorus, maybe I could just mention to you in closing. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race. In other words, be among the faithful band. So bravely run the race till we see Christ. It may not be just what it seems right now, but one day it will all be plain to God's people.